So first question that comes to mind when we start talking about photography for lighting design is, why do we need to shoot our own shows? A lot of theaters you're working with probably have photographers coming in. They're probably shooting thousands of photos of the show, and they're making them available to the theater company, and hopefully the theater company is then in turn making those photos available for you. For me, it comes down to three main things. The first one is that I don't trust anybody else to take pictures of my work. And that is because of years of experience of being burned. So for a long time when I was first starting out, I would either ask a photographer for a really specific shot about a thing that I really wanted to see, or I would rely on them to get something that I really wanted, and then it would come back and they would have technically done what I asked, but it's a very tight close-up of the person instead of the whole scene. So often as lighting designers, we're looking for shots that are going to present our work. We want it to show something that's going to show how the lighting is interacting with the scenery, interacting with the costumes, etc., etc. Oftentimes, photographers who are hired by the theater companies, that's not their main focus. Their main focus is to get promo shots for the company. So they might be focused more on getting those close-ups of the actors, of the stars, things like that. So I only can trust myself to get those shots that I want, because at the end of the day, if I don't get them, I can only blame myself. Other big thing for me is that I know the show, right? I've been in the room for the last 2 weeks. I've been working on this show for weeks or months at a time. That photographer is probably only coming in that night to shoot that show. So I'm going to know where those actors are going to move. I'm going to know where I need to line up, where I'm going to need to frame that shot, more so than a photographer who's coming in for the first time is going to. And then for me, the third big thing is I actually use the photographing my show as a really important part of my actual design process. So what I mean by that is I actually shoot during the final dress rehearsal. And what the final dress rehearsal allows me to do is move around, go to all different seats in the orchestra, see the show from lots of different angles. Sure, a lot of the time I'm looking at it through my camera viewfinder, but I'm getting that chance to really move around and really see the show from all of those various seats. If you're not doing this already as part of your design and tech processes, I recommend doing it, photography aside. The show looks very different from sitting behind the tech table than it does throughout the rest of the audience. Try to go to the mezzanine, try to go to the balcony. Obviously, don't always want photos from up that high, but if you can get there or send an assistant or an associate up there as part of your process, it's going to make the design that much better. Because sure, it might look really great from that table, but you don't know what that person 5 rows back from the orchestra is seeing. So by taking my own photos and moving around a lot during that dress rehearsal, it allows me to see the show from lots of different angles that I wouldn't even if I was just moving around on my own, because I have a vested interest in moving as much as possible to get as many shots as possible. The best part about a dress rehearsal to me is that there's no audience in the space. That means I can move all around the theater. I don't have to worry about ducking in front of people or disturbing people. I've shot shows where the producer will come on and say, there's going to be photography being taken and blah, 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 blah. And in theory, that should give me a free license to move around. But you always feel super awkward doing that because you don't want to disturb the person who's there to watch the rehearsal or to watch the preview or whatever. So the best part about doing it then is you don't have an audience. My other favorite thing is that there are no posed photos then. When you do a photo call, every photo gets posed. And so you don't necessarily, as a lighting designer, I'm not necessarily going to get that whole list of shots that I might want into that photo call list. And then in addition to that, they look somewhat fake. There's a very big difference in capturing the action in real time and capturing it as a posed photo later on. So for me, I want to capture those photos in real time. I want to see the real emotion, the real energy. I don't want to see the energy that's being put in after a 2-show day or in the middle of a 2-show day and everybody's tired and just wants to go home. I want those real action shots. Sometimes when I shoot during a dress rehearsal, if I can't get up and move around, I'll do this. I'll throw my camera on a tripod and I'll tether it to my computer. So the photo you're seeing right now, this is from an outdoor production that I did, and this is just a kit lens, a nice wide lens there, and I've got a little Bluetooth device on the top of my camera, and I'm tethering it, and I can hit go, 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 and just take shots every 10 seconds or whatever to get good photos. So again, love shooting during the dress rehearsal, hate shooting during a photo call, hate shooting when there's an audience present. So last week when we did our webinar number 4, I think it was, about design in a pinch, and I'll throw a link to that up on the recorded version of this if you did miss that, you all saw this little triangle before, right? Hopefully everybody has seen this, even if you didn't see my webinar last week. And this is basically corresponds to just about anything we do in the theater. You can have 2 of these 3 items, but you're not going to get all 3 of those things. Just not possible. So today I'm going to be showing you a different triangle that we call the exposure triangle. And a lot of the images that I'm going to be using today for this first part of this are pulled from various photography websites. So if you're interested in reading more or seeing more about them from those sites, down here at the bottom you can check out those websites to be able to get a little bit more in depth. So the 3 main things that we are concerned with when it comes to camera settings for any photography, let alone production photography, are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. So if you look at this right here, we're gonna come back to this in a second so you can understand kind of what all these various numbers and abbreviations mean, but just kind of keep this in mind as we're going through and visualize it kind of like we visualized that triangle from last week. So let's start with shutter speed. So a shutter speed, when a camera shutter opens, it's basically opening a physical shutter to allow light to enter into the sensor of my camera. The shutter speed basically means how quickly that shutter is going to reclose again after it's been opened. So the faster it is, the less light it's going to allow into the camera, and the longer the shutter speed is, the more light it's going to allow into the camera. So obviously that makes sense when you're dealing with still images, but where it becomes complicated is when you're dealing with a lot of motion. So here's a graphic that kind of shows a couple of examples of different shutter speeds and the motion blur you might get from them. If you were doing a portrait or you're doing a posed photo, for example, if you're doing a photo call, you could probably shoot at a much higher shutter speed. And the reason for that is because you're not trying to capture that motion. If you think about it, think about what that sensor is seeing. It's going to capture anything that's being sent, that's coming through that lens as long as that shutter is open. So if everybody's standing perfectly still, it's just going to get that value. But if somebody is moving across your stage, you're going to get all of the various values that have occurred while that person is moving. So it's this delicate game we play when we're dealing with a lot of motion, which, you know, again, I do a lot of musical theater, so I'm trying to capture big dance numbers. So it's this game of trying to get just the right shutter speed to freeze that motion just enough to get it and not blur my photo too much. Because once that flow, you know, there's nothing you can do. If you're shooting at a half second here like this, there's no chance you're going to recover that photo. You know, it's just not possible. Now there are some chances if its photo is a little bit dark, we could brighten it up. But if you've got motion blur in there, it's going to be next to impossible to fix that. Here's another kind of visual representation of that. A pinwheel sitting still, easy to capture, really high shutter. Or excuse me, a pinwheel spinning at a really fast shutter speed, 1/500th of a second, it's going to capture that in a still image. Start to slow that shutter down a little bit, you're going to get that motion blur until eventually you're going to get where you can't even make out the individual blades at all anymore. That's kind of shutter speed in a nutshell. Again, it's measured in fractions of a second. So the higher the number, the larger or the faster the shutter will be. So 1/500th is going to be very fast versus 1/30th, it's going to be a little bit slower. Most DSLR cameras have a range anywhere from 4,000th of a second, 8,000th of a second to sometimes up to 30 seconds of open exposure. So when you, obviously in the theater, I would never ever use a 30-second exposure thing unless I was trying to do something super artsy. That's used for if you wanted to capture the night sky, for example. You had a very still sky and you wanted to capture those stars. Then I would leave that shutter open as long as possible to get as much light data in as possible. So then moving on to aperture. So think of an aperture like the iris of your eye. It's going to open and close, and it's going to change how much light is allowed to come through the lens. So the shutter speed is set on the camera itself. Well, everything is set on the camera, but the shutter is actually a part of the camera versus your aperture, which is going to be part of your lens. So different lenses, depending on their quality, can have different possibilities of what they can give you for an aperture. So obviously the larger the aperture, the more light is going to be allowed through. The smaller the aperture, the less light is going to be allowed through. Here's a good representation of multiple parts of that. So the interesting thing about aperture to keep in mind is that the numbers appear to be the opposite of shutter. So in this case, the higher numbers are actually letting in less light, and not the opposite of shutter, but the opposite of what you would think size-wise. So you would think 16, that's going to be a bigger hole opening than 2.8. But what that number actually is it's a fraction of the whole. So a 16th is a much smaller fraction than a half. So think about it that way. So if I've got an f2.8 aperture setting, I'm going to be able to capture a whole bunch of light. If I've got it all the way up here at f16, I'm probably not going to capture a whole lot of light out of that. This is also how we work with depth of field. So again, depending on what you're shooting in the theater, sometimes you want, if you're trying to do something artsy, sometimes you want to blur the background a little bit. Other times you want to see everything as crisp and as clear as possible. And obviously, it's really hard to accomplish that with every single shot that you're doing, because as you see here, as you open that aperture more and more, you become more susceptible to the blurring of the background. This is similar to how your iPhones and all of your smartphones now do that depth of field stuff. It's using, well, it's getting a little more complicated. This guy's got multiple cameras, but it's changing the aperture in order to create that depth of field, to create that blur in the background. One more graphic for that. And just keep in mind, again, the lower the number, the larger the aperture. So a lot of kit lenses are not going to give you a whole lot of range when it comes to your aperture size. Some lenses don't give you any range. Some lenses are fixed, and this is what it is. It does not adjust. Zoom lenses typically will allow you to adjust it, but a lot of prime lenses or fixed lenses will not. So then the last thing in our triangle to talk about is ISO. The best way to think about ISO for me, and there's probably way better technical explanations, but for me, it's basically how much sensitivity, how much light do you want to allow your sensor to actually capture. So the lower the ISO number, the less light it's going to capture, but the sharper your image is going to be. The higher your ISO number is, the more light it's going to allow to be recorded, but the grainier that image is going to be, or the fuzzier that image is going to be. So we have to find that balance. This is a really good, I found this image at lightandmatter.org. I think it's a really good visual representation of how all of this kind of plays into one another. So think of water in this case like the light that your camera is trying to capture. Your aperture then would be the tube size. So it's going to be, or your pipe size. How much water is that pipe allowing to flow through? That's your aperture. Your shutter speed would be that faucet valve. So how quickly can I turn on and off my faucet to allow that water to come through? And then the ISO would be the size of the container that you're allowing that water to flow into. And then finally, here's kind of a good graphic of all of those things kind of all at once. So the challenge here again, if we go back to our triangle, is when we think about what we're trying to capture in theater, we're trying to capture usually something that's pretty low light, we're trying to capture a whole lot of motion, and we're trying to see as much of the stage as possible. So if we start looking at these things one at a time, you can see, okay, well, if I want to freeze motion, then I need something up here that's going to be a really fast shutter speed, right? But now all of a sudden my photos are getting darker. They're not allowing as much light in. And in addition to that, I've got this issue with my aperture. I'm not allowing much light in at all because I've had to close the aperture so much when I get up to here. So it's this constant battle back and forth between these three things. For me, mostly shutter speed and aperture that is what's going to allow us to actually get the photos and get the what we want to capture. So most cameras, I shoot on Canon, but then, the two big players in this market are Canon and Nikon. Of course, Sony makes cameras. There's a bunch of other companies as well. But the three modes that we want to look at, let me switch over here real quick. I'm going to try to do a live demo of this for the first time. I'm getting real fancy here, everybody. Stand by. So the modes that I like to shoot in shutter priority mode. So if you look at that little wheel that I showed you a little while ago, and here it is on my camera, you've got M for fully manual, AV for aperture priority, TV for shutter priority. The reason I like to shoot in shutter priority is because when I'm working in the theater, most of the time, I'm trying to adjust how quickly my camera is capturing things on the fly. So I've got this little thumb wheel right here that I can roll back and forth, and you can see my aperture value, my shutter values changing there in real time. I let the camera then figure out what it's going to do with the aperture. And the reason for that, again, is because I just don't always have a whole ton of time to be able to make both of those changes on the fly. A lot of our lighting is very dynamic, and so it's going to change from a very bright thing to a very dark thing really quickly. I need to be able to make one quick roll of my finger like this to change that shutter speed and make sure that it's going to get the thing that I want it to get. If I switch over to aperture priority, it's going to give me the same idea. I have this, but now you see, as I'm changing the aperture, it's changing what that shutter speed is going to be for me. So the problem with this for me, again, if we go back and we think about our triangle for a second, as I'm changing that aperture, sometimes it's going to give me shutter speeds that I don't want. I don't want a half-second shutter speed. It's just, there's no way I'm going to capture what I'm looking for unless somebody is perfectly still. And then, of course, the other mode that we can shoot in is fully manual mode. And, of course, you know, a lot of professional photographers will shoot this way. And if I was doing all posed photos, I would 100% shoot this way. But again, the problem with our theatrical work is that it's almost impossible to have the time, at least for me, to come in here, change my shutter, change my aperture on a shot-by-shot basis. You know, when I'm taking these photos of the shows, I'm moving around and I'm kind of doing like a rapid-fire spray of photos over and over and over again, and I don't want to spend the time to actually go through and adjust all of those settings manually each time. So that kind of leads into a great next segue into this, and that's kind of how my philosophy for shooting when it comes to this. So if I was shooting at a photo call, then yeah, it would be easy to pose all these things, get the exact settings I want. It would be easy, it would be wonderful. But that's not going to be possible. So instead what I do is, my goal is to take as many photos as possible during that dress rehearsal and then go back and clean them up and edit them later. I'll hold that shutter button down and get as many as I can, because for every 5 that I take with that really fast motion, I might get maybe 1 or 2 or 3 good ones. And so off and on, especially on my large musicals, I'm shooting upwards of 1,500 to 2,000 shots in an evening, which sounds like a lot, but it's really not when you think about you're taking 5 at a time for every moment that you want a photo. And then I'm going in later and I'm cleaning those out and getting the ones I don't want. The other big thing that I do when I shoot is I shoot in camera raw and not in JPEG. So if you're not familiar with this, part of my demo in a few minutes is going to be going over this specifically. But basically what's happening when I'm capturing a photo in my camera is every single pixel on that sensor, and this is where 20 megapixels, 25 megapixels, however many millions of pixels I have, each one of those pixels is recording data for my light levels. It's recording red, it's recording green, it's recording blue, it's recording brightness, it's recording all of that data. If I want to have the camera process all that for me and make a JPEG, I can, and it's going to lock in where those levels were and kind of do some processing, do some smoothing, do all that kind of stuff, and give me a much smaller file size. But if I want to go in and edit that kind of stuff later, the raw photo is going to give me all of the various data that that sensor captured. So then I can go back in and make really fine adjustments to it after the fact. Again, that'll make a little bit more sense in a second when we get onto the demo. So before I move on to that demo, let's go ahead and take a quick question break. It's going to take a quick question break, so go ahead and throw your questions up in the chat, and I'm going to go ahead and get the demo set up here in the meantime. Again, keep in mind there's a little bit of a delay, so there might be silence for a second while we wait. Any questions about what we've covered so far? All right, I'm going to go ahead and jump forward then. Nothing's come in quite yet. And if anything does come in the meantime, I'll take a pause and go back to answer them. So today we're going to be looking at Adobe Photoshop Lightroom, and I've got a couple of example files here. Again, if you're just joining me, in the description for this video, there is a link to this Dropbox folder that has these 5 files in it. What you might notice about this is that I have both JPEG versions and RAW versions in here. So the RAW versions came right off the camera. The JPEG versions are processed from the camera. I didn't do any post-processing on them. Right away, we can notice the file size difference, right? So the camera RAW file is almost 24 megabytes, and the JPEG version is about 2 megabytes. So if I'm trying to shoot a whole lot of photos, obviously the JPEG might be beneficial to me because I can fit a whole lot more photos than I can. I still don't want to do it. I still want to shoot in RAW, and I'll just have a very large memory card instead, or I'll empty out the memory card at intermission. The other thing most cameras can do is shoot in both modes at the same time. So it will automatically it'll automatically record a RAW version for you, and it'll automatically record a JPEG for you. Obviously, then you're taking up 25 megabytes worth of space, or 26 megabytes worth of space, because you're saving 2 files. But that can be really helpful. That can be really helpful when you're going in to edit these photos later. Part of this, the setup I was doing, I would like to do this if I had just shot a show. I've deleted a lot of my bad shots, so it was hard to find some ones that were not quite good, because I usually delete all of the bad ones so that they don't take up disk space. But okay, so a couple of questions here came in. For camera settings is the place I usually start at the beginning of the shoot. So typically, yeah, I will typically start, let me switch over here. So yeah, I'm going to answer a couple of quick questions. At the beginning of a shoot, I will typically start with, I'll start playing around a little bit with what my pre-show look looks like, and I'll try to get a good shutter starting speed for there. A lot of it depends on the lens that I'm using. So again, if I'm using a lens that allows me to have a much larger aperture, then that allows me to shoot at a higher shutter speed. If I'm using just a kit lens, or if I'm using my, I've got a 18 to 20 millimeter lens that I use sometimes. When I'm using that, I have to shoot at a lower shutter speed. So I take those kinds of things into account. If I'm doing a show that I really, really, really want to get good photos of, typically I'll rent a lens. Basically, if you're working in a major city, there's going to be a company that allows you to rent lenses. And they're relatively cheap compared to the purchase price. So for example, on some of these photos you're going to see, I went and I rented that lens for $50 for the weekend versus $1,800 to purchase it. And so far, I'm sure over time you could do a cost-benefit analysis of when it would become worth it to purchase it. But for me, it's not going to become worth it for a very long time. So, I didn't talk specifically about the difference between Nikon and Canon yet. I'll be completely honest with you. I don't really have any Nikon shooting experience, so I don't know a whole lot of the main differences between the two. When I was first starting out and knew nothing at all, I got a Canon camera, and so I kind of got into that ecosystem and I stayed there. So I'm sure somebody in the chat might be able to give a little bit more, a better explanation of the main differences between the two. But really, to me, if I'm shooting in RAW, I'm shooting these large photos, it all comes down to what I'm doing in the editing section of it, not necessarily what I'm doing, what kind of camera body I'm shooting with. I have noticed when I've had some friends in the past that have shot on Nikon, I've shot on Canon, that my Canons have been able to get better blues and the Nikons have been able to get better reds. But again, that's just been like completely circumstantial, and I don't have any actual hard data to back that up other than just what I've seen, and this would have been a couple of years ago. So I'll get to some of these other ones in a bit, because some of them are a little bit more generic questions, so I'm going to save those for the Q&A at the end, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to jump back in here to the live demo. So I am using Adobe Lightroom Classic. I have not played around with the Creative Cloud version yet, or just the cloud syncing versions yet. I'd like to, I just haven't had a chance to, because I don't do, I shoot a show and then I don't look at it. I don't look at Lightroom again for a couple months until I have another show to edit. So I don't really keep up with that kind of part of it. I use the tools that I've been using for a while and that really work for me. So if we look around in Lightroom here, if you are following along, you want to go ahead and make yourself a new catalog that has nothing in it. So I did that already. That's File, New Catalog. You can, in theory, you could have all of your production photos in one catalog, and you could separate that out by collections and folders and stuff like that. I tend to do a different catalog for every show that I shoot, just to keep the overall size and complication of it down a little bit. So within this, the two main tabs we're going to be looking at today are Library and Develop. So Library, these are both pretty self-explanatory. Library is going to be basically all of your photos. This is where you can import things. Develop is where we're going to be actually making changes to our photos. So I'm going to go to Library here, and I can do one of two things. I can go to File, Import Photos and Videos, and then I can navigate to where those photos are on my hard drive. Or if I'm on a Mac, but if I've got a Finder window open here, I can grab all of these and I can drag them right on top of that window, and it's going to import all of those photos. Now, one quick thing to keep in mind when you're looking at this import options here are these settings at the top. Copy will basically create a copy of those files and move them to a location of your choosing. Or put the copy in the location of your choosing. Move will move the files that you just had to the location of your choosing, and add will leave them in their current location and add them to that particular library. So I always like to do add so that I don't actually accidentally take up a whole bunch of extra space. So I'm going to get all these in here. Now, if for some reason only your Canon or only your camera raw options are showing up, you're going to want to enable a preference here. So you go to Lightroom Preferences, And this guy right here, treat JPEG files next to RAW files as separate photos. So I'm going to enable that, and that's going to allow Lightroom to import JPEGs with the same name. So these are all here. They're ready to go. I'm going to hit import. It's going to do its thing. Typically, this would take a very long time if I was shooting a show, because I'd be importing 2,000 photos at once, but I'm not right now. And then the next thing I would do is I would start going photo by photo, and I would delete the ones that I didn't want. So the easiest way to do that in Lightroom is what's called pick and reject. So if you go to photo here, there's some options. Where is it actually? I don't actually ever use the keyboard shortcuts. Well, I can tell you the keyboard shortcuts. So P is pick and X is reject. So you see when I hit X there, it said set as rejected and it grayed this out. So what I'm able to then do is go through a whole pass of this really quickly. The ones that I don't like, I can reject those, and at the end I can delete all of my rejects. One little handy tip and trick here, if you put your caps lock on and then you start doing P and X, it will automatically advance to the next photo after you hit a P or an X, which is super, super handy. I have on my Stream Deck, for those of you who've asked me about my Stream Deck and things I use it for in the past, this is one of the things I use it for. I have a capital X and a capital P button, so I can sit there with two buttons and just go through an entire library very quickly. Typically, that's the first pass I'll do. I'll go through the entire library, reject all the ones I don't want, and then, reject all the ones I don't want, and then keep the ones I do want. So to start off with this, we're going to start looking at photo number 1, which is going to be this guy right here. We're going to make sure we're looking at the raw version of it. So 1.cr2. CR2 is Canon's extension. Nikon ones, I forgot what the Nikon was, maybe it's NEF, I think it is, but it'll have a different extension. Right away, you can see some of the settings that were at play when I took this photo. So this was a rental lens. It was a 24 to 70 millimeter rental lens that had an aperture value of 2.8. So I had a fixed aperture on this. It stayed at 2.8. That's a pretty wide aperture. It allowed me to shoot at a much higher shutter speed. You can see it was shot at 1/640th, so that's pretty quick. If I didn't have this lens, let's see, actually this is a show that I didn't have that lens for. This was my kit lens that I have, an 18 to 200. This was shot at a much slower shutter speed. I can also see my ISO settings. Oh, that's something I didn't talk about in the beginning. So I typically leave my ISO on automatic. So on my camera, I'm able to set a maximum ISO, but the camera will always try to get me the lowest ISO possible, but never go above that maximum that I set. So my maximum is set to 3200, and oftentimes I find that my camera is going, it's either going to be 32 or 1600 when it's doing its automatic mode. Okay, so let's jump right in here. So a couple of quick things we can look at right away about this photo. The first thing is the photo is a little crooked. I tend to hold my camera slightly crooked when I'm shooting, and it's just the way my face is shaped. I don't know why, but that's how it works sometimes. That's how it works for me. So the first thing I'm going to do after I've done my pick and rejects, I should be in the develop tab for this. After I've done my pick and rejects, is I'm going to start straightening these things out. I'm going to try to click on things today rather than using keyboard shortcuts for you. So basically our first tool right here, this is our straighten tool. So I'm going to click that. The keyboard shortcut for that is R. Now, if you look around this, it's giving me various manipulation handles, and I can move this all around, and you can see it's recropping for me as well. So it's keeping the photo, it's keeping the aspect ratio of that photo the way I had it. Click reset for a second. So when I start to move this, those grid lines appear. And so what I'm looking at is I'm looking at the contents of my photo and I'm comparing it to those grid lines. And I'm going to try basically just to get him a little bit straighter than he was in the photo. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to hit enter, and that's better. Now my scenery is a little crooked, but he's pretty straight. So I'm going to call that good for now. You can also click and you can zoom in. You can see details of the photo like that. There's also tools here down at the bottom where I can see before and after. So that's this guy right here. I can see that side by side, so I could see half and half. I could, if I change this right here, now I've got my before on this half of the photo, my after on this half of the photo. Got top and bottom. I like to do this left and right. And then of course when you click and you zoom around, it gives you that same zoom on both the before and the after. So this is helpful as you're starting to edit your photos and you're trying to stay as true to the original as possible. This way you're able to kind of zoom around and see what the original looked like. Of course, it does take a little bit more graphics power, so oftentimes I'll edit the photo just in looking at the after, and then I'll come back and add this other part to it. Okay, so let's look at this photo for a second. So this is a photo, again, raw, right off of the camera. Let's think for a couple of minutes here about what this this photo is lacking. So right away I'm seeing he's pretty well lit. He's clearly in a follow spot. I see his face really well. I see his upper body really well. But I don't see a whole lot of my scenery. My background has become super dark. I'm not seeing much of it. I've got that cool like Austrian curtain behind him. I'm seeing a little bit of the red of that, but not much. I'm only seeing with the camera, you know, the brightest parts. I'm getting a little bit of discoloration down here for some reason. That could have been a random reflection off of a piece of glass or something. Who knows what that could have been? So a couple of different things that I don't like about this photo. And of course I've got all this beautiful ornate scenery up here that I don't see. So the reason that this photo is dark like that is because I try to expose my shots to the brightest thing on the in my viewfinder. And so in this particular case, it's the person. And typically when I'm shooting in the theater, the person is going to be the thing that's the most important, that I want to make sure I'm not overexposing. If we look over at photo 4 for a second, you can see this is the opposite problem. These people, this is, number one, isn't a very good photo, but these people, these two leads right here are very overexposed. And we're going to get to this later on in the demo. It's going to be very hard for me to fix this, if not impossible, because I don't have any kind of darkness information for any of the contours in either one of their faces. So if I come back to our photo 1 here, you see I've got a lot of room that I can play with this. He's not overexposed. He's nice. He's bright. I've got a little bit of shadow in there I can play with. But it's a lot easier overall to bring up the brightness than it is to blow out, to fix that blowout of a follow spot. Okay, so the first step in this, the obvious thing we could start playing with right away is to start playing with our exposure. So if I take my exposure slider and I start bringing that up, you see I'm seeing a lot of background now. A lot of that background is coming out. But now he is starting to get washed out. He's starting to get blown out a little bit. And this light, the follow spot spill behind him is also getting to be a little bit ridiculous. I don't want to see all of that. So I don't want to change the exposure necessarily right away on this photo because I don't want to brighten everything. I just want to brighten parts of it. So I'm going to reset this back to 0. Whoops. Setting this back to 0. Other cool thing about Lightroom is it gives you a full history of all the commands you've done here. And as you roll over them, you can see in this little preview up top here, you can see exactly what that would do. You can remove certain ones, you can jump back and forth in them. So it's really cool timeline-wise there. Okay. So the first thing I'm going to play with instead of instead of the exposure is going to be our shadows adjustment. So in Lightroom, when I talk about shadows, a shadow is basically a region of my photo that has a little bit of brightness data in it, but not a ton. So this is not necessarily the full darkness here, but things like, you know, the area under his eyes or the wrinkles under the curtain. So if we take our shadow slider all the way up, we see all of a sudden we've got a lot of value here. We've got a lot of scenery. We see this whole curtain on the left side that I didn't even see before when I was first looking at this. But the problem with this is it also kind of made our photo completely washed out. So now I've taken anything that had a shadow to it and I've just brightened it up so much that it feels very washed out and very flat. I've lost some of that dynamic range of brightness that the original photo had. So there's a couple of other ways we can accomplish what we want here. So I'm going to reset those shadows back to 0, and now I'm going to play with the black slider. So the black slider, it's the same idea, but instead of a shadowy region, these are the regions that have no brightness data to them whatsoever. Now obviously the more extreme we go here, it's also going to bring up some of those shadows a little bit, but it's going to boost up all of my dark areas a bit more. And you can see right away that in this particular photo is a little bit better as I bring this up and down than that shadow adjustment was. So these things can kind of work in harmony. I might boost this lower end a little bit, boost these guys up a little bit, and now I've got a little bit more brightness coming out of this photo. And if we go back to our side-by-side, hopefully this is coming across in the YouTube stream. I hope it is. But you can kind of see right away, now I've already started to pull out a little bit more detail here. I've already got a little bit more of this bust. I've got a little bit more of this curtain. So I play around with both of those things a little bit to be able to pull out some of those shadows. Now, of course, one thing we're going to notice right away as we zoom in is that now I've got a lot of noise in this photo. Again, this was shooting an ISO of 3200, so there was a lot of noise happening when this photo was captured. there's not really a way to get rid of that noise. That noise exists. Obviously, if you have a better lens, you have a better camera, you're going to get less of that noise. It's going to be more capable, but I don't have the money for it. So this is what I shoot. This is what I deal with. So Lightroom does have an option that allows us to smooth a little bit of this out. And actually, I accidentally had the sharpening preset brought on when I brought it in, so that added a little bit more noise. But still, you can see here's this, it's still pretty noisy, and bringing up those shadows just brought out more noise. So instead what I do, I've got a noise reduction slider here that I can play with, and basically what that's going to do is it's going to start to add a little bit of blur to the individual pixels to kind of smooth out some of that noise a bit. So the danger with this is if I take this all the way up, it's going to take my computer a second to process it. Now it looks like he's like made of porcelain, and he's like he's a doll, and this is an airbrushed photo. So if you're doing something with scenery, yeah, this might look really cool up here, but now his face is no thank you. So like everything, it's a little bit of a game to get those right levels. So sometimes I'll bring it up around 20 or so like that, and that's just enough. I usually look at the face when I'm looking at these things. So now we've got a pretty decent version of this photo. I still probably wouldn't use this photo in my portfolio because it's, again, not showing me much in terms of overall composition of the scene. I've got this extra follow spot stuff down here I might not really like. But there's other ways we could go in and fix this. So let's look at photo 2 for a second. Photo 2 is this guy right here. This is a really cool shot. This is from the end of the show. We had these 4 people on the front of the stage. Let me go back to just the main one here. And we've got our main character here upstage kind of in this gobo. So right away we can notice a couple of things that we don't like about this photo right off the bat. So we look at these two women who are clearly the focus of the scene. This stage left one is a little bit darker for some reason than the stage right one. Now, in real life, that probably wasn't the case, but because the eye see things differently than the camera does, I'm going to have to go in and fix this a little bit. The other thing is that this guy here and this guy here are in gobos. Like if you look at his hand here, he's in a gobo, and you see his chest is pretty lit here, but in this particular moment that I shot this photo, he must have leaned back a little bit and his face went out of the gobo light. And then of course, in addition to that, we have a light-skinned actor here and a dark-skinned actor here, so there's obviously going to be a difference in those two things. Then the biggest thing for me about this photo that I hate is what's happening on these columns here, because this is not what it looked like in real life. In real life, these columns were actually lit in a much cooler color, and they were very, very, very dim intensity. So what happened when I shot this is that because I was trying, again, to expose to the ladies here in the front and expose to this beam of light so it didn't get blown out, I lost a little bit of the color data and the brightness data that I got out of these columns. So right away, looking at this, it's going to be really hard for me to fix this with any kind of overall adjustments, right? I can bring my noise reduction up a little bit like I did before. I can come in here and I can play with my shadows. I can boost those shadows up. I can boost my blacks. I can do all that stuff, but it's not going to fix these core problems. So this is a case of where I'm going to start using a brushing tool within Lightroom to start fixing some of these things for me. So to do that, I've got a little paintbrush right here above my basic tool palette. I'm going to click on that, and now you see my cursor has changed to this this target. And as I roll my scroll wheel, you see it getting bigger and smaller, and you see the size adjustment on the sidebar there getting bigger and smaller. You can also adjust the feather. So the feather is basically how much of it fades away as you go towards the outside of that circle. So the circle you see, the whiter circle in the center, that's like my brush, and then the other circle you see around it, this is the it fades away to nothingness. So think of this kind of like as a beam angle versus a field angle, because most of the people watching this are lighting people. So that center is my beam angle, the outside is my field, right? So the first thing I'm doing when I do this, and this is just a personal preference, I turn the exposure on this brush all the way up. And the reason I do that is because it allows me to see exactly where I'm painting. So now I'm clicking and I'm dragging, and I'm just going to kind of roughly come in here, and I'm going to highlight this column. I'm going to try to stay away from this guy's face. And this is an additive thing, so I can release my mouse and click again. It's not going to, like in Photoshop, when you click over and over, it's going to do it more. It's not doing that. It's just adding to your current selection. So I have that column. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to highlight this column. Again, being very careful not to hit their faces, being very careful to try to stay just on the columns. Now I see where I've got highlighted. I'm going to go ahead and reset that exposure back to 0. And now I have just like any other photo, right? It looks or just like the original photo. But I can start playing with the settings of that brushed area. I can bring my color temperature down, for example. I could even maybe bring my color saturation down a little bit to get it into that cooler world again. Maybe brighten it a little bit, maybe darken it a little bit. I can do all those things to get it looking a little bit more like it did in real life. Now, what I'll say to this is it's really important, obviously, and hopefully this goes without saying, that you're not making changes to your photos to make them be something that they weren't. All the edits that I'm doing when I'm editing my photos are to compensate for deficiencies in both myself as a photographer and deficiencies in the photo itself. So with the equipment I'm shooting, I cannot capture the light level on those pillars in addition to the light level that's on the ladies downstage center. It's just not possible with what I have. So I rely on this part of the process to come in and to touch it up. Again, I'm not making these look different than they did in real life. I'm doing it as close to real life as possible. If I wanted to, I'm going to click done here on this brush. I could change everything about this photo. I could make the whole photo feel like it's taking place under the sea. You know, I can make it warm if I wanted to. I can make it green. Again, because I'm using that raw data, I can do all of that. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to undo real quick. I'm only making changes that are bringing the photo back to as close to real life as possible. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my brush here for a second. I'm going to click on that existing brush. I'm going to play with it a little bit more. I'm going to take that a little bit cooler, and I'm going to desaturate it a little bit more. And I'm going to pull the sharpness down a little bit, and that's going to give me a little bit more blur on those columns. So now they've kind of faded away. And now if we look again at our before and after, you see this huge difference. So I'm still kind of in this warm world, and if I was really playing with this more, I could spend more time cooling it off. But you get the idea of how powerful that is. And then I'll do the same thing then for, let's work on her face, for example. I'm going to zoom in a little bit. I'm going to do a new brush, and I'm going to just like blow her face out right now with exposure. Doing just her face is not the best idea because it's going to look unnatural. So I'm going to kind of come in here and I'm going to do almost like a headshot or a quarter body shot with a follow spot. I'm going to brush that a little bit. I'm going to then reset my exposure back. And now I'm just going to play with that exposure slider a little bit. Now her face is coming out better. Maybe I'll play with the shadows. Maybe I'll fill in the areas under her eyes a little bit. Play with all of these things. Highlights, I didn't really talk about highlights and whites, but highlights and whites are the opposite of shadows and blacks. So highlights, it's going to be anything that's got a decent amount of brightness value, whereas whites are going to be the brightest parts of your image. So you can, play with all these at your leisure to figure out the best settings there. So that's just a little subtle bit of a highlight. Now she's a little bit brighter than she is, so I could come back and I can edit that just a touch. I'll pull that exposure back down just a little bit. They're pretty even now. And if I look at my before and after, you see the difference. Now she's lit a lot better than she was over here. And because I took some of that sharpness data away, her face is a little less blurry. Now some of the noise dots you see in the back, that's actually LED pixels because there was an LED wall back there. If I brought my noise reduction slider all the way up, those would all morph together. And if I really wanted to, I could go in and I could carve that out and play with it, but I don't really care about that in this particular case. So there's those two settings. Let's go ahead and play with our stage left man's face over here. I'm gonna make another new brush, and once again, I'm gonna just blow his face out as much as possible. Make him look like a ghost here. I've got that. I'm going to reset my exposure. Again, the reason I start with the exposure all the way up is just so I can see exactly where I'm working. So right away I see if I start bringing this exposure up, what that's doing to him, it's making him look very unnatural. It's adding a lot of noise to the photo. Because his skin is so dark, I don't really have a lot of brightness data to play with there. All the camera really recorded is darkness. So maybe instead of playing with exposure there, I want to take some of the blueness away from his face. So maybe I'll take some of the saturation down just a touch. And maybe that little bit, that's enough to give him that little bit of a highlight. And again, this is not fake. I'm not faking the light on his face. You can see this light was hitting his chest. It just happened to be in this particular moment, he leaned back out of that gobo, and I didn't get the shot I wanted. So this is an example of when, yeah, having a pose photo would be nice. You could have them standing there. You could get them to adjust exactly where you want them, but not necessarily a luxury we all have. Okay. So now let's play around with the JPEG version of this photo for a second. So far I've been playing with the raw version of it. Let's look at the JPEG version. So I'm gonna reset that raw one back to where it was when we first started. So right away, if we click back and forth, these photos are basically looking the same. There's a little bit of brightness difference, a little bit of smoothing happening, but not much difference. It looks pretty much like it does when it's in this raw file. But watch what happens in the raw file when we do that example earlier of pulling up all of our blacks and pulling up all of our shadows. Look at how much other detail is available in this photo to us that we didn't necessarily see. Now, of course, this grain is not necessarily usable, but you get the idea. There's a lot of detail. If we do the same thing with this JPEG, I've got very little available to me now. So if I go back over here to this, you see I've got curtain coming in. This first photo we did is a really good example of this. If I go again, I bring my shadows and my blacks all the way up here. I've got all of this curtain I can play with. If I do the same thing to my JPEG, I've got not a lot of curtain to play with. So the reason, again, because of that is because the camera, when it saved this JPEG file, has disregarded a lot of that brightness of information, that color information that we recorded. Versus with the raw file, it's actually all that information is embedded within that file. So when you're working with these raw files, what's cool about them is you're not actually making destructive edits to these files. It's saving it as metadata that's attached to that file. So again, I can come in here, I can make these adjustments. I could export this, and then if it's still my raw file, I can come back in and keep making further adjustments. And again, if we did the same, let's go back to here. I could do the same thing with the brush on this one that I did with the other one, but do the opposite. I could come in here and I could brush this. I could pull that exposure down to fix that. But then we start kind of going into that unnatural territory that I don't really like. So hopefully you can see right away why shooting in RAW is a much better idea than shooting as just JPEGs. Just looking at the amount of data we have available. Now, if we go even further with this, if we take the exposure on this way up, again, not a super useful photo. We'll go back to this first one. This is a better example. I could bring this exposure way up. I can see a whole lot of stuff. If I do that same thing on this photo, now you notice I've got a lot more destructed or compressed artifacts on this, and I'm never going to be able to get the same color out of it that I could get out of this. So shooting in RAW is kind of like that last little line of defense that I have in case I mess up the shot or do the exposure wrong. It helps me to get that little extra in there that I need. And other times, I've accidentally shot shows before where I've got it on some I've set my white balance accidentally to something that I totally don't want. Being able to shoot in RAW means I can come back in and I can change that white balance to fix it. So like let's say this photo was actually very warm, but I accidentally shot it really cool, I could come in here and I could fix that. Or I could even just fix the areas of it that I wanted to fix. Great. So one other cool thing to look at here, let me go back to where this photo was. So this is where our edited version. You can also copy paste all of the settings from one photo to another. So let's say you took 5 shots that were kind of in rapid succession of the same scene. You go and you edit your first one and you want to have a base point jumping off for your other ones. To do that, I'm going to go here to settings and I can click copy settings or shift command C. And again, I have a button for this on my Stream Deck. And then within this, you can choose exactly which ones you want to copy. I typically don't copy any of my cropping or transformation information, my rotation data, because that's going to be different from photo to photo. But if I know that these are all in the same scene and I'm having to bump up the white balance a little bit or bump the exposure or bump the shadows, I just got to notice that the stream quality went down a little bit. Hopefully that fixes itself. I'm going to copy paste those things from photo to photo. So I'm going to hit copy on that. I'm going to come over to my other photo and then I can hit I can hit paste settings. And it's going to paste all of those same settings. And right away, just looking between the two, they're actually pretty similar because we didn't do a whole lot of edits to that particular one. Let's see here. Okay, it seems like the quality is going back up just a little bit. Sorry about that. Okay, so moving on. So I'm going to look at, we've got a couple more photos to look at here with slightly different problems to them. So this is photo number 3, if you're following along at home. Photo number 3 here has a couple, this is a pretty cool photo, but it's got a lot of different areas to it that we might want to touch up. So for example, I exposed this to these people up here as best I could into this map. This is from a production of Around the World in 80 Days. This floor down here actually had a whole lot of blue on it, but it's not really giving me a lot of that in this photo because, again, I was focusing more on this bright area and less on the dark area. So right away, again, I could start playing around, and just by bringing that shadow slider up, I've brought a whole lot into this photo. And I'm not getting as much washing out with this because I'm not as close and as detailed with my faces as I was in the other one. So maybe I'll bring that up a little bit, maybe boost the blacks a little bit if I want to. Or if I reset that, I could come in here and I could do this as a brush again. I could make a nice big brush. I could brush this floor and very quickly pop that up a little bit. I could even make it a little bit more saturated if I want to, because in real life that was like an LED blue. So there's no way I didn't get the depth, that color depth on this photo that I had in real life. So looking at it side by side, I made it a little bit more vibrant. I could make all of the color a little bit more vibrant if I wanted to, especially if you look at this floor. It's got a gobo with some green underneath it. I could bring this vibrance up, and it's going to make that color that much more vibrant, probably closer to what it was in real life because it was all LED. Again, a big challenge here is, especially when you're working with multiple sources of light, with LED, with incandescent, with arc lamps, getting those things to match. So what I find a lot is the photos coming off the camera will be a little bit washed out. They'll be a little, slightly washed out, slightly less vibrant. So just by boosting that vibrance a little bit, I can get that color back to where it was in real life a little bit better. Then, of course, the other thing I notice up here is I've got this like the weird green highlight in the sky. If I bring my exposure all the way up, you can see it was actually a piece of LED tape on this scenic piece up above. But it didn't really do anything in our photo because it didn't do a whole lot to light up that piece. So there's probably not a whole lot I can use it for. So I'm going to get rid of that. So I'm going to come in here, again with a brush. I'm going to brush that whole thing, and I'm just going to take the exposure all the way down, and now it's gone. I could honestly do the same thing here if I wanted to. Again, this is now going into the world of editing what the photo actually looked like in real life. But if I was doing this as an artistic project, not necessarily as a portfolio project, you could do a lot of cool stuff with that. So you can see again where that brushing happened. Okay, so two more photos we can look at here. This is kind of the opposite example of what we've been looking at with the overexposed photo. This is a very, very underexposed photo. So you can see here the camera did a pretty decent job of capturing this blue. Why is my stream health so low? Don't like that. Well, hopefully everybody's still with me. It seems like it's still happening. Okay, I'm gonna keep going, and then if it ends up being too gross, I will I'll put the recorded version up for everybody. So anyway, so we're looking at this. It did a pretty decent job of capturing this blue, but our actor here, who's the main part of this shot, is completely in the dark. So I'm going to look right away. First of all, I'm going to see if I can bring up my overall exposure. And on this particular photo, I was able to boost that exposure a decent amount without having a whole lot of grossness happening, a whole lot of artifacts happening. I can boost my shadows a little bit as well. And now her body is in a pretty decent light. I might come in here and I might brush her face a little bit. Again, just ever so slightly. Just like that. Maybe cool it just a touch, because when I brought that all up. So now you can see right away I've brought her out a little bit. But now when I brought that exposure up, I lost some of that cool dynamic range that I had on this frosted plexiglass with the light behind it. So maybe I'll do a separate brush for that, and I'll come in here. Bring that exposure down a little bit. Maybe pull my contrast up a little bit. Now, the challenge with this is that I'm actually kind of shooting myself in the foot a little bit with this, because I'm actually doing two opposite things to this region of the photo at the same time. So because I brought the overall exposure of the photo up first and then came back and brought this one down, in this particular photo, it didn't really matter. It's not really destructive, but you can start messing your photos up very quickly and creating a lot more artifacts and things like that if you start making opposing settings basically happening. So this particular one, it worked pretty well. But I want to be careful of that. So instead, what I might have done is I might have done these as separate brush regions. I might have brushed her body as much as possible and then done this as a separate region and adjusted them independently. Okay, so one more photo to look at here, and this is that one we looked at in the very beginning. This is photo number 4. This is the one that is completely blown out. So again, in addition to this being blown out, it's also just a bad photo. I have somebody walking in it. I think this wasn't even during the show. This was like taken during a break. Like there's no scenery on stage. Nothing is really happening here. So let's see if we can do anything to fix this. And I have a pretty strong feeling, and not just because I did this earlier, but I have a pretty strong feeling that the answer is going to be we can't do much. So right away I could try pulling my exposure down. Maybe from afar that looked kind of good, but now I've lost all of my other stuff, so that's not going to work. Maybe I pull some of the whites down. I pull those really bright sections down. That's doing almost nothing for me. Maybe my highlights I pull down. Again, that actually looks a little bit decent on the outside here, and if this photo was really small, maybe that could work for me, but it's really we're not going to be able to do much with this photo if anybody wants to look at it up close. So really, there's really nothing I can do to fix this, because again, all of that brightness data that would have been put in as captured as part of this face, none of it exists. I've got no range left there. So not really much we can do there. Now what I could do, this is a good example of how we can really play with color, because there's very few colors in this shot. If I could get rid of that blue or that purple, come all the way down here. That looks a little bit interesting. I can go the opposite way. I could go more pink with it. I can also do different, I can change the values of what those colors are. So in this particular case, I've got this kind of purple light. I can come in here to my purples, and I can change the hue of all of those purples down to blue. I could also change the saturation of them, so now they become white. All kinds of fun things you can do. And again, this kind of borders more on just like the creative side of things and not necessarily the portfolio documentation side of things. Oh, good, the stream came back up. So but you get the idea. If you're making spot edits to things, this can be super, super handy. One last thing that I did forget to show you that I want to point out, I'm going to go back here to this photo for a second and reset it, is lens corrections. So if I open up my lens corrections tab here and I hit enable profile corrections, I'm going to pop that back and forth a little bit. You probably didn't even notice when we were looking at this before that there's a slight fisheye effect to it. That's because this was shot at 24 millimeters. It's a pretty close, pretty wide angle, or pretty wide focal length for this shot. So what this profile correction does is it kind of flattens that out a little bit. It automatically detects what lens you were shooting with and will adjust it to that. So that's helpful, especially if you're using a smaller, a wider lens than even this one. It allows you to make those corrections. Sometimes I use it, sometimes I don't. But that's that. So let me switch back over here for 1 second. Stand by. So yeah, so again, this all kind of comes down to this idea that we're constantly playing this game when we're shooting in the theater between our two main settings being shutter and aperture, but also our ISO. So we always want the fastest shutter speed we can get with the most light being allowed into the sensor as possible. And again, those things are usually at odds with one another. So that is kind of the end of my formally prepared stuff. If you have questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to switch back over to Lightroom here. And yeah, if anybody has any questions, throw them in. I will be hanging out for a little while. And great. So yeah, throw your questions up. I apologize, the latency has gotten even worse since we started this, so. I think I can change the latency actually now that the actual other stuff, I can't once it's started, great. Question came in, do I ever use Adobe Bridge to manage image files? I don't, and the reason for that is because I I don't shoot, I'm shooting a show every month or so, maybe a couple shows a month, and sometimes I'm editing them, I'm editing them all in one chunk. And so I use the tools built into Lightroom. There's other tools that are available to manage all that stuff, but Another question just came in. What Canon body have I been shooting with? I will show you. Let me switch over here. Stand by. So I'm shooting currently with a T5i. So this is actually not a super high-end camera. The T5i is kind of like the, the Rebel line. It's not even the most recent Rebel. I've had this for a couple of years now, and I think they're up to 7 or 8 now is the model number, but it does the job for me. I do have this spare battery pack at the bottom, which is pretty cool. What the spare battery pack allows me to do is put 2 batteries in my camera instead of 1. So it's got this little slide I can pull out. 2 batteries instead of 1, which is super helpful. I also then have a T2i, and that's actually what I've been filming myself with for all these streams. And that actually has my current lens on it. So that lens that I have on there is a 18 to 200. So that one gets a little bit wider than that rental lens I had. This has just like a 50mm prime on it right now because I needed something to do the demo with. So those are actually the only lenses I own. I also have the kit lens that comes with it, and I just kind of rely on rental lenses other than that. So yeah, and that one up there is a T2i. All right, let me switch back here. So question was, what is my method of storing, organizing, and backing up my photos? So for me, like if you took my paperwork class last week, I talked about how much I use Dropbox. So all my final JPEGs, like as soon as everything is rendered, which actually that's something I didn't talk about, I should talk about that. But as soon as everything is rendered, I put them all in a Dropbox folder by show name. So I have all that, and typically I'll go then and I'll delete all of those original the original raw files because I just don't need them anymore. I very rarely will need to go back and make another batch of photos and they take up so much space. We're talking 30, 40 gigs per thing. So I typically have, I have an external drive that I'll work on, or I'll try to get them on the hard drive on my solid state so it's a little bit faster, but then the raw files go away. And then of course they're backed up in Dropbox, which is then backed up on all my machines, backed up in the cloud, and backed up in Time Machine. So it's very hard to lose anything. Do I record shows and runs? I don't. I'm getting into it a little bit more now. So next week, or I can't say it's going to be next week, but one of the upcoming weeks, I'm going to do a tech process tips and tricks webinar. And one of the things I'm going to talk about is Stamp and how I use it in the production process to capture video and how it talks to EOS and stuff like that. So when I do that, I'll talk a little bit about how I use it for video. But I've been relying on, my main contract right now is down in Atlanta, and we have this awesome marketing guy who works there who gets this beautiful, beautiful footage of the shows. So I've been relying on that, but it's something I've been thinking about more. I also have a GoPro that I use. So I don't use the GoPro for like production shots, but I use it for designer runs. I use it for time lapses, which most of you have probably seen my time lapses. And I'll use it to record runs sometimes, but again, the GoPro does a really decent job, but it doesn't give me as many settings and options as as a DSLR would. Differences between shooting for a portfolio and shooting for recalling cues and palettes. So for me, a portfolio, I try to shoot a story when I shoot my portfolio shots. So like I will have, a lot of people say you should only have wide shots in your portfolio. I disagree. I like to have a mix of everything. I like to tell kind of the overall visual story of the show. So I might do more close-up work than I would for a cue photo, for example. I might do more close-ups in my portfolio. Not all close-ups, but I'm gonna frame the things in such a way that will allow me to show off the whole show. And then for recalling cues and palettes, I want a wide shot, and ideally I want it from a balk rail or something like that. So that's something that I don't always even do for my shows because I'm not doing a whole lot of shows that are going to be remounted or that are going to tour. I've done, in the last couple of years, I can count on one hand the shows that I've had to remount, and even then, things have been so different about them that it's just easier to recue. But if I was doing it I would want wide shots. One quick thing I didn't show you, and this is kind of going back to that question of how to organize your photos. Let me make myself a little smaller here. This is how to actually export these things. So once I have them, I'm going to go to File, Export. And then in my export, this is going to tell me basically what I want to do with that file. I can give it custom names. I can tell it where it's going to go. I can limit how big the file is, so how much data is stored with it, which is super helpful for like a portfolio website, something like that. I can limit all the photos to be no more than 2 megabytes or no more than a megabyte. This is also where you can add watermarks. So I have this MWLD watermark, and basically what that does, it just puts my website in the bottom. I don't do a giant watermark across it. I just don't see the need for it. But you can create watermarks. You can add images to them. You can do, I've got one here that I've done in the past where it's, a giant one. So this is actually a good segue into the next part of this conversation, and that's when you're doing photos and how to share those photos with others and how to get credit for your work and how to get paid for your work. So when I'm shooting for my portfolio, I'm not getting paid for that. Like, I would never expect to get paid for that. A long time ago in my career, I started shooting a lot of shows, and I noticed that some theater companies that I was working for stopped hiring photographers because they knew that I was going to get really good shots of the show, and it was going to save them some money on the budget. And I was a lot younger, and I didn't necessarily see anything wrong with it. I was like, oh, yeah, of course you can use them. But then as I started thinking about it more, I started thinking, well, now I've just displaced this other creative professional from a job, and also I've got now this responsibility on my shoulders that I'm not an expert at. Right? Like, I'm sure that I said some stuff that if they've got professional photographers watching this, you're going to be like, that was totally wrong. I'm sharing my experience and what works for me. So I don't want to be responsible for this theater company not having marketing shots if they're not, if my photos don't come out good enough. So I've kind of gotten away from that. And what I find is that when I'm asked about it from some companies, I typically reply back with, I'd be happy to. Let's discuss what you think an appropriate fee would be for those services. And then 9 times out of 10, they say, never mind. So, and it's always a problem. People take your photos, post them, et cetera, et cetera. To a certain extent, I don't care about that as much. I'm not making a living off of these photos. They're to show off my work. So to me, if it's marketing the show and it's doing a decent job with the show, put it out there. That's great. I get a little pissed off sometimes when people will edit out my watermark for social media. I'm like, it's literally the smallest watermark possible. You don't need to cut off that tiny little website at the bottom, but it happens. So that's kind of exporting and watermarks in a nutshell. And you can also do other things with them. There's all kinds of stuff you can do in the export window. And then Lightroom also has some other features that I don't even I have never dove into. You can do print stuff right from it. You can create movies from it. You can create websites. You can do all this stuff from it. I typically just like to export the photos and I pull them into whatever various place I need them. Another question here. When purchasing a camera, what are the main requirements you want the camera to have? So the biggest thing for me, because somebody said it earlier, I think Will said it, like the lens is the most important thing. So pretty much with certain caveats, any camera body you have, if you've got a really good lens on the front of it, you're going to get a lot of great shots. Like this photo right here was taken with a $600 camera with this T5i that's 5 or 6 years old now. But because it had this almost $2,000 rental lens on it, I was able to get this really, really cool, really beautiful shot. Now, of course, as I zoom in on this, there's noise in this photo. Again, because I don't have a full frame, I don't have all this kind of stuff. So the professional shots are going to come out really great. If we look at, if you go on my website and you look at some of the shots from this show, there's some beautiful shots of the professional shot. Because he's got way better equipment than I do. But it's been enough that I've been able to create my portfolio and to document things with it. But anyway, so back to your question. To me, the lens is way more important. When it comes to a camera body, I'm looking at the fastest burst speed possible. I want to get as many photos in a burst as I can. I think shooting in RAW on my T5i here, I can get, I think it's 6 or 7 photos in a burst before I have to wait a second. Because basically what happens when you take that photo, the camera is processing it in a little buffer and then moving it to the memory card. And so the more photos you can put in that buffer, the more you can capture in one setting. So obviously, if you've ever seen a sports photographer, they hold down the shutter and they're shooting, 30 frames per second all at once on their $6,000 camera. I'd love to be able to do that, but I don't have, I could never justify the cost of what that would cost for the kind of stuff that I'm shooting and doing. So let me see if there are any other any other questions that came in here. Looks like that's just about all the questions, and we're coming up on just about an hour 15. What lenses do I normally like to use? So this lens that you're actually seeing on the demo, the data you're seeing right here, this is my go-to rental lens. I have it ready to go in my cart in the various cities I work in for different lens rental places. So it's a Canon 24-70, so it is a zoom lens. It doesn't get quite as wide as my lens that I own, but it has it can get this really, really wide aperture. So that f2.8 is what's super, super important to me here. My actual lens that I own, if I go back to this photo, this is the specs on that. it's a 18 to 200, so I actually have a lot better zoom range on it, but my aperture only goes down to 3.5, so I can't let as much light in. And again, if we go back to that triangle example, I want as much light as I can get so that I can shoot at a higher shutter speed. This is at 1/250th. We go back over to this one. This is at 1/400th. So it's not a huge difference, but it's enough that it makes a difference when you're trying to freeze that live motion. This guy here, this was shot on a kit lens, so this was an 18 to 55 millimeter, and again, can't get very much there. So what I would say, like, if you're thinking about going out and buying a camera, you can get a decent DSLR body for around $500. I haven't looked in a while, so they might be cheaper than that now. But around $500, you can get a decent DSLR body. And then where you really want to spend your money is in the lens. And again, rental lenses are a totally viable option. There's lens rentals all over the country, locally, and you can get them shipped to you. And it's way cheaper than purchasing it. I would have to do it would be like 20 shows before I paid for that lens, essentially. So, and I don't even rent it on every show I do. If it's a show that I really want to get very specific photos of, I'll rent it. And I've also rented, when we did the park last year, problem with some of our shows, is that you get so close to the stage and you've got this wide thing and you can't capture it all. So I rented, I think it was like a 13 millimeter lens. So it had a slight fisheye effect, but I was able to fix that. And it got some really cool wide shots. So, but if you're looking for my daily driver is 18 to 200, and it gets me just about anything I need. Great. All right, so if there's no other questions, I think I'm going to go ahead and sign off for the evening. So hopefully this was useful to some people. I'm going to make this video private so I can go back through and watch it, and I will see how the quality held up. If it didn't hold quite up, I'll put the recorded version up on YouTube instead. And so hopefully look at that in the next couple of days. I will be making an announcement for next week's webinars, probably sometime this weekend. If you're interested in getting those announcements, go to my website, mikewoodld.com/classes, and you'll be able to sign up and get all the information sent to you that you might want. So, great. If anybody has any questions, feel free to reach out to me on Instagram, etc., and I will see you all next week. Thank you.